guys ready? What the hell? I don't know what to make of that. Maybe it's just that slide. Yeah, unless it's just that slide. One of my favorite, I think, most ingenious acronyms, seasonal affective disorder. Bad, being related to how much light day there is. This phenomenon, virtually non-existent in the valley, because we are so close to the equator here. Back in my home state of Wisconsin, it's rough sledding in the middle of December, because dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and doesn't get light until what you would call late morning. And just set aside the biochemical issues there. Darkness is kind of a synonym, isn't it, for depression? And we know that, in fact, in people who live in the farthest reaches of the northern hemisphere, this really is a very real phenomenon, and it's very, very clearly connected to just a dysphoric mood created by an overproduction of melatonin. And darkness stimulates melatonin to help you fall asleep at night, to have you turn your lights out as you're growing up and learn to sleep in the dark. It all synergizes. Those of you who are headed to study abroad with my wife and I know that we just recently dropped the Reykjavik segment of the trip. And my good friend, Dr. Arneson there, who's going to help us as part of that tour, sees a lot of this bad seasonal affective disorder nitrogen, because what we would have seen in July is 24 hours of daylight. What we would have seen if we had chosen to go in December is about 4 hours of daylight. That's pretty rough to tolerate. So that's basically what this thing is all about. Very treatable. People sit under lights. Not all are. This is like if the whole country goes into a significant dysphoric state. No, it is those who are perhaps most susceptible to it. You remember, I've been preaching all along, there is a bio, psycho, socio-cultural model that we're employing here, and those things must converge all at once in a very unfortunately negative sort of way. But okay, so that's that. There is a test question waiting to happen somewhere in there. You're here today, TGIM. You know what you've been here. You're going to get the test question right, because I just gave you all the information you need to handle that question or more. I said we were going to do suicide today, and I didn't choose words very well there. We're going to cover it today, and we're going to get to it. But I always forget I added these slides here because I do want you to remember, and you've heard me kind of preach on this a little bit too much. But I'm going to add something to it that's not on the slides, another gift for you, and I'll try to put it into the test question waiting to happen if you can remind me of these things. But let's revisit this just for a minute, and promise me that you'll read the disclaimer on the front page. You can't miss it. On the front page of the syllabus, read that disclaimer again as we visit this very delicate, very provocative topic. You do not want to even suggest to someone that they ought not to be on the SSRI they're taking, because you could, in fact, precipitate a suicide if they decide on your recommendation and not their doctor's to withdraw from that drug without medical assistance. The most difficult part of any psychoactive drug is going on it and getting off it. Now, that having been said, disclaimer has been repeated in as many ways as I can possibly do it. You are well informed about the consequences of being a junior psychiatrist and making recommendations to your friends and relatives. The fact, however, is, because this is an academic university where we visit the truth, the fact I wish to remind you of again is that there is absolutely no support for biochemical imbalances in the brain explaining any of the mental disorders, and that includes schizophrenia. Where this all came from is very complicated. We don't have enough time to visit the complicated details of how this all evolved. One of the more insidious forms of it was really bad logic, as I mentioned before, in which we say if someone takes these medications and they get better from being dysphoric, perhaps, then maybe it's what's being elevated that was too low. That logic is flawed significantly. In other words, if serotonin is being increased by taking these medications, available serotonin, that neuroreceptor synapses is being increased, well, then maybe that's the problem in depression, is that there's not enough serotonin there. That whole theory lives so long that NIH and NAMI and everybody talking about mental illness have a thing in their web pages about depression is a biochemical imbalance, much like diabetes, and you must replenish that diabetic-like state with additional serotonin, and that's the most effective treatment for depression. Well, since then, it's been shown so conclusively that placebo works as well. And you cannot use the serotonin replenishing theory to account for the effects of a placebo. That is to say, and I will return you to one of the very first things I told you, do SSRIs work? What's the answer? Yes. The problem is not much better, if at all, than placebo. Or, when even compared to benzodiazepine. And drug companies don't do those comparisons. They don't like to do that. They like to compare it to placebo, banking on this placebo-like phenomenon that occurs, which is really nothing more than mobilization of us getting better because we expect to get better when we're treated. And that's a good thing. So, all right, number one, then there is no evidence that serotonin is a problem with depression. If you think about it, it is almost a stupidly oversimplistic understanding of how complex life is and what causes people to get depressed. People get depressed because they perceive a loss, as I mentioned before, or they have a huge disappointment, or they find themselves in an inescapable aversive life situation from which, by definition, they cannot escape. And the complexities of that are deep, very deep. I could spend the rest of this course describing case after case after case in which the obvious source of the depression was environmental. I have yet to meet someone who woke up one morning with an imbalanced serotonin neurotransmitter level in their system, and now we're reporting that they were depressed. Okay. So the other part of this that I want to emphasize, as is seen in this slide, is that in fact, when someone begins SSRI treatment, or for that matter, any psychoactive medication, a biochemical imbalance is created. Make no mistake about it. So in a way, that's kind of insidious, isn't it? Drug companies telling us, well, it's your neurotransmitter systems all these years, and we just need to replenish this stuff that's missing because you have a biochemical imbalance. When in fact, in reality, and we know this well now, this is inarguable. This is inarguable at this point. It is not an imbalance that exists at the beginning, but it is an imbalance that's created when these toxic substances, and they are toxic substances, are introduced into the body that have a profound effect on neurotransmitter function. And if you wish to look into this in greater detail, read Joanna Moncrief, and I have her reference on Blackboard for you, and she will explain to you the accelerator and brake phenomena that occur when medications are introduced for these purposes. So, okay, with all of those caveats and all those warnings that I've given you now, I hope you understand the full context of this whole picture. I think what's really remarkable about all this is that there are many methods of psychotherapy, most important of which are CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and even simple exercise, aerobic exercise, that when compared are more effective. So what and why will we continue to see this as the first line of treatment for depression, which is a very commonly encountered phenomenon, as you well know? The other thing is that we haven't mentioned, and again, those of you interested in psychopharmacology, please read Joanna Moncrief's book. Very readable. It's absolutely fascinating. I think it will be, 50 years from now, they will look back on it as a classic, as an absolute classic piece of work. It's called The Myth of the Biochemical Imbalance. And she is a British psychiatrist, psychopharmacologist, with excellent credentials, one of the biggest names in the world in that field. And she points out that it is not an underlying disease that's being treated. It is the effect on behavior that these drugs cause. And physicians should think about themselves as consultants to their patients with regard to what these effects are. The whole gamut of effects. And she discounts, and I think it's absolutely brilliant, the idea of side effects. Side effect is a marketing term. There are effects of drugs that vary because all of you are very different in a lot of different ways. So reactions to drugs can be extraordinarily variable, but there are a set of effects that occur. One of those is on these drugs reporting feeling less depressed. And if that were clinically significantly greater than placebo, then I wouldn't be up here preaching this, except for the fact that these drugs do, in fact, and have in fact shown to be lethal in some instances, especially when given to young people, and potentiating the likelihood of suicide or other forms of violence deriving from psychic indifference or akathisia, which is that coming out of your skin feeling that gets amplified by 100-fold for some on these drugs. One of the interesting corollaries from this that I think is worth considering, inasmuch as these drugs are called antidepressants, again, in the past, they were only characterized by their action. There were MAO inhibitors, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. There were tricyclic antidepressants. There are now SSRIs. They're all called antidepressants, a marketing term, not a term from science. And in fact, inasmuch as the most frequent report of the effect of SSRIs is decreased sexual libido, then one should really regard these antidepressants as sexual suppressants, sexual behavioral suppressants, which have the side effect of alleviating depression if the person is told that they are in fact antidepressants when they're prescribed. So the point is neither of those is a good idea. Those are all effects of the drug. And that is what the psychopharmacologist says about these drugs and their effect on depression, not what the representatives of the pharmaceutical industry say about the effects of these drugs. So, okay, so I belabored that. I think it's very important for you to understand that. I think I've made the point here. I already told you probably my story of being asked by Psychi a few years ago to address Psychi and other invited people about when it was during Mental Illness Awareness Week and I think on Depression Awareness Day. And this is what really one of the many reasons I started digging deeper into this whole issue that I've been addressing now and then, was to find out that the very event that I was speaking at was started by and funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Most notably Eli Lilly, who introduced Prozac, and 5 months later funded the first Depression Awareness Days across the country, directly and indirectly, by the way. Okay, I don't know that I've made this point. Maybe I've even tested on it. Did I talk about cherry picking? I don't know that I have. Let me just mention it again. I think you need to understand. It takes two studies. Two studies to the FDA revealing a difference between the drug and the placebo for that drug to get approved. Now, one could run two studies, and if they're both statistically significant with regard to the differences and changes between placebo and drug, end of story, and wouldn't that be nice? But apparently we caught the pharmaceutical companies, and by the way, you still to this day cannot get raw data from the pharmaceutical companies who collect these data across multiple sites. They will not give you access to raw data, they'll only give you tables of results of those studies. But what they were caught doing was running 10 studies until they got two significant studies, submitted them to FDA, and got the drug approved. That's called, test question waiting to happen, cherry picking. It's not only bad science, but when it's a drug that can kill somebody, I consider it corrupt science. And that's why I am as passionate as I am on this topic. There are people who have lost family members. Did I tell you about WoodyMatters.com? Have a look at it if you haven't yet. And again, have some tissues close by when you do. Okay, so not only is that a problem, but the other problem is that a lot of these studies that were published were not written by the authors who are listed on the publication. They were written by employees of the pharmaceutical industry that was marketing the drugs, and they made, let's say, they made it worth their while, you understand that expression? Become the authors on that publication. Ghost writing is called, to me, corrupt science. If I did it, I would be fired. And in fact, I would beg to be fired if I ever did that, because that would mean I've lost my mind. I would never consider having someone perform a study, write its results, and ask me to be the senior author on it. That was what's going on. Last but not least, and I'll get off the pulpit, and I think which is really tragic, is those people who became critics were punished. David Healy, who is now has always been with Joanna Moncrief, one of the top psychopharmacologists in the world, because he testified about the increase in risk of suicide in young people on SSRIs. He testified revealing those data that he had analyzed, at least from the studies that he could get access to, which is, as I pointed out, a very difficult thing to do. He was on his way to the best job in Canada, in a research institute, having a high degree of prestige, and long story short, He was offered the job, but it was withdrawn when they understood pharmaceutical companies were going to pull the plug on funding that was going into that institute if they hired David Healy. Spencer Lefevre, who now I consider a dear friend, maybe some, well, I guess it won't happen in this. I would love to show you her paper entitled, it's under editorial review right now in a journal that I'm on the editorial board for. It's going to be published, but I don't have the privilege at this point to put it online. But the first part of the title is Shooting the Messenger. She was very critical of over-medication and ADHD and published data that showed extraordinarily high rates of ADHD in certain parts of the country, including the area that she was trying to develop a program for. Long story short, somebody accused her of scientific misconduct by having a slight, meaningless wording difference between what was published about one question in her questionnaire and what was actually on that questionnaire. She had to defend herself over a several-month period. In the meantime, the medical school she was working for fired her. She was completely exonerated in the end, but too late. She'd already lost the job. It was better things for her, sort of post-traumatic growth. You ought to hear her now. Plus, she has a multi-million-dollar grant that is overseeing health and safety issues in the healthcare industry. And she documents in this paper the experiences she had of persecution. She was a speaker at my conference in December, and you could have heard a pin drop during the entire hour that she spoke. It was absolutely riveting, and it shows you the extent to which powerful entities in this world, when threatened, when their bottom line, their profit margin is threatened, there will be prices paid if you're the one who's leading that effort. Okay, off of the soapbox onto suicide. So, first and foremost, there's no such thing as a successful suicide. So please remember that. I mean, it's a very bad choice of terms. It is a completed suicide. This is one of the most delicate issues, and indeed is one of the driving forces of the mental health treatment enterprise, and it explains why you see levels of desperation among us to try to find techniques. And indeed, these were not evil people originally looking for these drugs to help save lives. If one could give a drug to someone who was suicidal and that drug would make a difference, that's a very admirable goal, a very admirable outcome. And if only it were true. So we have a very high value in our society on saving lives and wanting people to live the full length of their lives, and that's as it should be. There are some interesting statistics, though, around suicide, and it is a delicate issue for me, personally and professionally, because I had to deal with suicide in my practice days. I can say, with all honesty, I never lost a patient to suicide. However, I saw patients who I characterized as victims of suicide. The impact of suicide on families is devastating. And I'm the closest person who may take on the guilt of someone taking their own life. This is something that you go to your graves with. This is a pain that people go to their graves with. So I felt an enormous amount of ambivalence in my practice days in dealing with those people who were in treatment because of having lost someone to suicide. And I almost felt, why didn't someone just take them by the shirt collar and shake them and get them to recognize what they would be doing to the people who love them? But it's not that simple. There are very young people who commit suicide. And the last thing on their mind is the impact this is going to have on their parents and other older people in their families. Suffice it to say, it is an enormously complex situation. And as much as you will find yourself in that situation directly or indirectly in any time in your life, it is one of the most challenging issues concerning the conflicting emotions of anger, depression, sadness, dysphoria, all of the things that are at the core, really, of what we examine in a course like this. It is indeed extraordinarily difficult. However, I will say this. There have been people to whom I've consulted both personally and professionally who have taken on the guilt of an adult who has committed suicide and left some indication that it was that person's responsibility. If it weren't for that person, they would still be alive. And that is a very cruel thing to do. I can only say to people that I have consulted to on that issue, I have said, do not buy that. Do not live with that the rest of your life. You are not responsible for keeping someone alive by behaving the way they expect you to behave at all times. But it is a very, very delicate matter, as you might guess. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's a very good question. You're really asking the question, is it possible to get someone to understand that before they do it? Because they're going to affect a whole lot of people. Indeed, you will come to know, to become a mental health professional or any kind of helping professional, you will be told that one of the first lines of offense, and I've done this in therapy, I saw a woman, I can tell you right now, she said she felt like killing herself. I thought, you know, understand that. I mean, we don't have time for the details of her life, but it was miserable. Everything that could have gone wrong had gone wrong. Plus, she had a dependent child who was about to be, well, really, in some senses, was an adult, creating a lot of difficult aspects of her life. And the only thing I could do was to say, do you understand that if you take your life, you will be hurting the people you love the most, and that's not what it is that you're trying to do. And as a woman and as a mother, it resonated with me. As fathers, I don't know that we have that sense, that much instinct, if you will, to draw on. Some would argue with that, and I can't defend that, but I think there's a deep maternal instinct that I never minded drawing on as a almost last resort. The ends justify the means. You'll hear one more time before you leave this course where I used an ends justifying the means in a way you may not agree with, but I think you get the picture. Was I addressing the question that... Well, I mean, she says, you know, they have to understand that they're going to hurt a lot of people, and I think that's very complicated. I mean, in some cases, there may be indications that, hey, we're trying to hurt a lot of people. And let's remember, suicide is often an impulsive act. An impulsive act that obviously can't be undone. That's what's so tragic about it. And that's why one of the most important things you will remember from this segment of the course is that indeed suicide is preventable. Someone will say, well, you know, when somebody wants to commit suicide, they're going to do it anyhow. Well, that's not always true. It may be true that someone will go out of their way so that someone does not intervene, so that they can carry out their plan as they wish. I may have told you about the guy I will never forget from the first years of my life as a mental health professional, postmasters, who was prescribed in that day tricyclic antidepressants, took a whole bottle. He looked just great in the clinic. We all knew him. He's one of our patients that everybody knew. Went home, filled his bathtub, took all of the antidepressant medications, and of course, this man was very serious about taking his own life. He knew that if the antidepressant medications didn't kill him, he would drown, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, so this is a very delicate phenomenon in our society, a tragic one. There are cross-cultural variations that play themselves out in often interesting ways, and you'll learn that indeed this is even more complicated when embedded in various cultures throughout the world. All right, most textbooks even today will say this is primarily, overwhelmingly indeed, a white phenomenon. Majority population, clearly, much greater risk for suicide. Very low rates, as you can see, amongst African Americans and Hispanics. I think what Hispanics and African Americans share, because I've worked in both environments, is a deep sense of the importance of family. Very deep sense of the importance of family. I'm not saying that doesn't exist in the white majority population. I'm only saying that there's a palpable difference in how deep that runs in black and Hispanic families when compared to whites. Extremely high rates among Native Americans. I could spend the rest of the hour describing to you why I think that's the case. It is a tragic one indeed, and if you have any idea of the details of the history of the American government's treatment of Native Americans, you will completely understand why the conditions on reservations are horrible. Low rates amongst Catholics and Muslims. Many Catholics in the group will tell us why. Yeah, this probably contributes to the relative low risk amongst Hispanics. Obviously, there's a high rate of Catholicism amongst Hispanics. And indeed, you're exactly right, it's a mortal sin. Every Catholic who's done one day of what do you call those classes? Yeah, that CC whatever thing. You can tell I got 12 years of it. I didn't have to go to CC whatever. I got a very heavy dose of it, and it was very clear, very early. As soon as I understood the word, you commit suicide, you got a ticket straight to hell. And let's just be honest about it. That works. And there's no other explanation for why Catholics commit suicide less frequently, although I've heard one non-Catholic remind me that there is no religion in which the people are more afraid of death than amongst Catholics. So that's a double whammy if you make those connections, and so be it. It's a good thing. We'll take it. Highest rates occupationally amongst psychiatrists? What's wrong with that picture? Yes. Oh, yes. By the way, for Muslims, I don't know if the connection is the same because I don't know enough about Islamic religion, to be honest with you. But someone once told me, I think it was someone of the Islamic faith in one of my classes, said it's very similar. There were very similar attitudes about suicide as Catholics do. But do you want to add something to that, or? That's an act of war. So that you have to separate an act of war from a civil occurrence of a phenomenon as we describe it in suicide. Now, suicide bombings and so forth are a whole different ballgame. And keep in mind, in extreme Islamic interpretations, there is a favorable outcome in the hereafter. And again, that's an oversimplification of a very complex phenomenon, but we would never look at an act of war, suicide, in the same way that we would suicide in the general population in under civilian circumstances. Dentists, number 2. So psychiatrists, what's up about psychiatry? Clinical psychologists, too, by the way, they're up there, but not quite as high as these two are. In fact, female clinical psychologists have a disproportionately higher rate of suicide. You know, I can't speak for psychiatry. I'm not a psychiatrist, even though I spent 30 years working with and training psychiatric residents. I don't know about psychiatry. I have not met unstable psychiatrists, frankly, in my career that I worked with or that I trained as residents. And that's a fact. And that's 30 years worth of work. I must tell you, I have met some weird psychologists in my career. One of the nicest compliments I got when I was consulting to industry, doing some stress management with corporate executives, well, and I'm still not sure how to interpret this, but the guy came down after the end of the workshop and said, you know, you're one of the most normal psychologists I've ever met. So I'm going to continue to think of that as a real compliment, but it's also a statement, isn't it, about his experience with psychology. So what's my point here? The point is, look, if you're seeking the mental health professions as a profession to solve your own problems, it ain't going to work. Or it's less likely to, let me put it that way. That's not the best way to achieve mental health. Because if anything, especially in psychology, all it does is create more and more ambiguity. The more education you get, the more ambiguity you find in life. The more there are no blacks and whites and it's all gray. So if anything, it's going to aggravate that sense of whether or not you're comfortable with life the way it is, rather than resolve and ameliorate it, or however you want to put that. Yes? That's a real good point. So she's saying, you know, the expectations you have to keep for yourself as a psychologist are higher than the general population, and that's really hard to do when you're around depression and dysphoria all the time. I can tell you flat out right now, there were a lot of reasons I left private practice, but one, perhaps the top reason, was I was completely burnt out. Completely burnt out. I worked long days into the night, Monday through Friday, Saturday morning hours, and Saturday afternoon and Sunday was paperwork. This is a fast track to burnout, and burnout, needless to say, is an additional risk factor for all kinds of things, not the least of which might be considering taking your own life. Okay. Pardon? Yeah, he's asking. He's bringing up a really important question. Sometimes suicide is very difficult to pin down. These are suicides. These data are suicides in which there is no question about the intent of the person taking their own life, without question. So that inexplicable guy that was found in his car dead because he went smack up against the biggest tree in the city at 80 miles an hour, not necessarily committed a suicide unless the person left the suicide note. It would be considered an accident. Oh, well, yes. The population sizes are different as well, but when you consider the whole population, suicides don't go unnoticed. The numbers are actually quite large. But when those numbers occur disproportionately in a percentage amongst these various ethnic groups, that's where they come up with these differences. So what about the dentist? I saw a few dentists in therapy during my private practice days. We had interesting conversations. This statistic has been around a long time. And in a nutshell, that's a long story too, but in a nutshell, In the words of one dentist, my patients don't like me. They don't want to be there. And, dentistry has come a long ways now, making their environments a little more attractive than certainly when I was younger. And I should also say, in some parts of dentistry, dentists find themselves, and they're highly skilled people, but they find themselves spending long hours going from office to office to office, or you know what I mean by office to office to office, clinic room to clinic room to clinic room, doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. I heard more than one dentist say that. So there are some occupationally connected features, I guess you could say, that you better be aware of if you're headed to that profession, that it ain't all glamour. It's a lot of hard work and long hours. And then last but not least, accounting for both psychiatry and dentistry, both are around psychoactive and narcotic drugs that they have freely available to them at any time they wish. And that has already been shown to be a factor not to be ignored. Okay, so you can see a few test questions waiting to happen on this page. I'm glad you showed up on Monday. If you had to make 5 questions off of this slide, I bet you could do it. The most frequent site of suicide in the U.S. is Golden Gate Bridge. I believe that still holds up today. It's still year after year the place where more suicides are committed than any other place in the world, or at least, not in the world, in the country. And San Francisco thereby has the highest suicide rate of any city in the country. It's a beautiful city. It's hard to understand. And Seattle being right behind it is just unimaginable. Anybody ever been to Seattle? No? If you get the chance, you must see it. It's an absolutely magnificent, beautiful city. And it's raining. It's probably raining. It rains. They say, they doctor their statistics. They say it doesn't rain that much. It rains a lot and it's always cloudy. And some people say, well, that's the problem. But there may be some other factors to consider, too. For example, Seattle has the highest per capita rate of prostitution in the country. Per capita. And that was difficult to explain until it was pointed out to me that they also have, that is the #1 destination for runaways. I mean, you could fill in the rest of the blanks here, right? The runaway going to a strange, large city, thinking that at age 16 they can get away from all their problems, and now they've found their solutions, and they don't find their solutions, and then ultimately to get by, they get under the influence of powerful and evil people, find themselves in prostitution, and in that state of desperation, ultimately take their own lives. Okay. Let's wind down with this particular slide because there's a lot more. There's a lot of test questions waiting to happen on suicide. Why? Because they're easy questions to make. And, they have all this disproportionality stuff in them and where do people commit suicide, why, and new words like parasuicide. If someone has had a history of attempting suicide, they are considered as having attempted parasuicide. That event is considered parasuicide. So in the suicidology literature, when you see parasuicide, they are talking about a history of attempts. It is the single most powerful risk factor for suicide, is a previous attempt. So here we are again. With all this research going on out there, the best we can tell you is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. As if you needed a college education to figure that out, right? Well, basically, that's what it is. All right, so these attempts are more common in women. There's a 3-to-1, this test question is wrapped all around this slide. 3-to-1. For every 1 male that attempts suicide, 3 females attempt suicide. Completions, however, occur as much as 5-to-1 more frequently in males than in females. proving once again that males are much more effective about everything they do when compared to females. I'm just testing to see how many people are still awake. So obviously that's not true. What is true? Guns versus pills. Pills that may be, depending on the nature, may be less likely to kill. Guns, there's a certain way, of course, that I will not articulate. But those people who are very serious about suicide know exactly how to do it so that it will be unmistakable. And I don't mean just shooting yourself in the head. It's actually not a good idea because there's a good chance that you may end up being alive and brain damaged the rest of your life. But it is clearly the case that that accounts for the difference. With that having been said, the gap is narrowing as we speak. Women are now more likely than they were before in previous generations to employ a violent, firearm-related method of committing suicide. 200,000 attempts per year, 27,000. This may be an old statistic. I don't know. It doesn't vary a lot in terms of the actual numbers. In terms of the actual percentage or prevalence within the society as a ratio. But again, there's that word success, as I put it there, to remind you that is not the word to use. The word to use is completion. Greatest risk factor, parasuicide. You will know that as the previous attempt. Depression is a huge risk factor for suicide. That's question waiting to happen. But suicide is most likely to occur as a patient rebounds from depression on the way back up. It is very difficult to ferret this out from being started on medications, especially if the person is young, that are associated with not a high rate of suicide, but a disproportionately higher rate of suicide. With that having been said, anyone who's been around depressed people know that in the depths of their depression, they barely have the initiative to take their own lives, but that may very well be the time they plan it. And now as they begin to elevate mood-wise off of that very depressed state, they now have the energy to complete it, and often they do. Okay, there was a couple other hands. You can stop down if there are burning questions. You can stop on the way out, but I wanted to finish on this slide. And then we'll talk about risk factors when we're done with suicide. And we'll move on to eating disorders.
So you read which psychology course you're taking, right?